Pat Morita is remembered worldwide as Mr. Miyagi, the soft-spoken mentor who turned wax on, wax off into a life lesson. But the truth behind how Morita became Miyagi is a story most fans never heard, and it's nothing like the calm, wise image we saw on screen. In his final years, Morita opened up about what really went on behind the cameras, how he was nearly rejected for the role that defined his career, why certain scenes sparked heated battles with the studio, and how deeply personal memories shaped the character in ways nobody realized. In this video, we're revealing the untold story Morita carried with him until the very end, one that changes how you'll watch The Karate Kid forever.
Jerry Weintraub didn't want me for this. He wouldn't even consider me for a reading. Every time my name came up in the casting submittal process, he was adamant. He says, I don't want a comedian. I don't want a comic actor for this role. This is a heavyweight part. I want an actor.
Back in the early 1980s, Pat Morita was in a strange spot in his career. Most people knew him as Arnold from Happy Days, the cheerful diner owner with a quick smile and even quicker one-liners.
See, I speak Japanese, Chinese, Korean, a little Hungarian.
Well, tell me something. What do you consider yourself?
Good looking.
He had been working for decades, first as a stand-up comedian and then as a character actor, but Hollywood wasn't exactly offering him deep or dramatic roles. That's why, when the script for The Karate Kid started making its way around the industry, Morita saw something in it that felt different. The part of Mr. Miyagi wasn't just another supporting role. It was layered, heartfelt, and carried the kind of emotional weight he had never been trusted with before. The problem? The studio didn't see him that way at all. Producer Jerry Weintraub, who had built a reputation as one of the toughest figures in Hollywood, had already made it clear Morita was not his Miyagi. In his mind, the role needed someone who carried the same gravitas as legendary Japanese actors like Toshiro Mifune, the towering star of countless samurai films. Weintraub wasn't interested in a comedian, especially not one who had made his name playing a sitcom role. He wanted serious, dramatic, and above all, someone who looked like they had lived through the kind of personal tragedy Miyagi's character held. But director John Avildsen, the same man who had given the world Rocky, wasn't convinced by Weintraub's vision. He knew The Karate Kid wasn't going to work unless the audience believed in the relationship between Daniel LaRusso and his unlikely mentor. Avildsen wasn't looking for a legendary presence. He wanted someone who could be vulnerable, tender, funny, and wise all at once. So, despite Weintraub's resistance, he pushed for Morita to audition. That audition process wasn't easy. Morita wasn't given one chance to prove himself, or even two. He was called back again and again, 5 or 6 times in total, each time putting on the same old cardigan he had bought at a thrift store, trying to disappear into the character of Miyagi before anyone in the room could dismiss him as Arnold from Happy Days. He added little touches, like bowing slightly when he entered, not as a gimmick, but because he understood the quiet dignity the role required. Still, the shadow of doubt followed him. Every time he stepped into the room, he knew the odds were against him. Hollywood had always pigeonholed him as a joke, never the heart of the story. And yet, he kept showing up, patient and determined. What happened on that final audition, the one that broke the cycle and changed his life, wasn't planned. It wasn't even scripted. And it was powerful enough to bring the director to tears. But even then, the fight wasn't over. The studio still wasn't ready to let go of their doubts, and Morita was forced to wait yet again. It was during that waiting period a small personal choice, one that seemed almost irrelevant at the time, that completely shifted the way everyone saw him.
I had spinal tuberculosis. And in those days, any kind, in the 30s now we're talking about, anybody that got tuberculosis practically died because there was no medication. They said this kid would never walk.
And I walked from the hospital into camp.
I was escorted from the hospital by an FBI guy to join my parents at an internment camp.
One of the smartest moves Pat Morita ever made was also one of the simplest. He stopped getting haircuts and let a scruffy beard come in. For years, audiences had only seen him clean-shaven and polished, the way a sitcom character was expected to look. But with the new look, suddenly there was a different weight to his appearance. He looked older, more seasoned, like a man who had carried heavy memories. Without even knowing it, he had begun to line up perfectly with the version of Mr. Miyagi the studio thought they wanted. Around this time, John Avildsen just wouldn't let go of the idea that Morita was the right choice. He kept pushing back against Jerry Weintraub's doubts until, weeks later, the producer finally relented. But it wasn't a full green light. Morita was offered exactly one screen test, and even then, the deal was written in a way that showed how little confidence the studio had. He had to sign a contract for the lowest pay scale, and they kept the right to replace him at any moment. Morita didn't argue. He knew this was his one chance to prove that Miyagi wasn't just a role he could play, but a character he could live inside. When the big day arrived, Morita met Ralph Macchio for the very first time. Macchio was only 21, straight from New York, and by his own admission, he was nervous to the point of jittery. Sitting there with his leg bouncing under the table, he wasn't sure how this comedian was going to pull off a character with so much depth. But Morita immediately set the tone. He poured Macchio tea into a paper cup, let it spill a little on purpose, and then calmly said, "Lesson 1. Balance." In that moment, something clicked. Their energy shifted, and the chemistry was there from the start. During the test, they didn't even rely on the script. They improvised what later became the now famous chopsticks and fly scene, playing it out with a natural rhythm that felt more like two real people connecting than actors hitting marks. Macchio later said it was like Morita wasn't even acting. He had Miyagi in his skin and in his mind. When the tape was screened for the executives, the room went quiet. Nobody said anything for a good 10 seconds. And then Weintraub, the same man who had fought so hard against him, finally admitted, "I almost made the worst mistake of my life. You've got the part."
Miserableness in this world. Arnold had this capacity to just kind of crack you up when you least expected it, and it just superseded any kind of whatever stereotypical thinking people may have.
For Morita, that victory came at a cost. The stress had been so draining that he drove straight from the lot to a hospital and checked himself in for exhaustion. And as much as the role was finally his, the battles with the studio weren't over yet, because the very scene that would later define Miyagi and even earn Morita an Oscar nomination was almost cut from the film entirely. Now, when people look back on The Karate Kid, one of the moments that almost everyone remembers isn't even a fight scene. It's that quiet night where Mr. Miyagi gets drunk, mourns his wife and child, and shows Daniel a side of him no one expected to see. Today, fans call it the heart of the film, and it's the scene that helped Pat Morita land an Academy Award nomination. However, here's what most people didn't know. That scene almost didn't make it into the movie at all. On paper, the scene barely existed. The script had it written out in just a couple of short lines. He drinks. He weeps. He passes out. That's it. Nothing about Miyagi's history, nothing about his emotions. Morita looked at that and felt like it was missing something huge. He told director John Avildsen that if they played it as written, audiences would miss the chance to really understand who Miyagi was and why his wisdom carried so much weight. The problem was that the studio didn't agree. Executives looked at the scene and immediately labeled it a pacing cemetery. They thought it was too long, too sad, and that showing the strong, almost mythical mentor breaking down might make people uncomfortable. To them, The Karate Kid was supposed to be an uplifting underdog story with training montages and fight sequences, not a quiet, heavy character study in the middle of it all. But Morita knew better. He insisted that Miyagi needed to feel real, and that meant audiences had to see the pain behind the wisdom. So he sat down and rewrote the scene himself. Instead of playing it flat, he added pieces of his own life. Morita had been born Noriyuki Morita, and during World War II, his family had been sent to internment camps in places like Gila River and Tule Lake. He remembered the barbed wire, the isolation, and even the death of a family member in camp. Those memories, combined with his struggles as a child battling spinal tuberculosis, gave him a deep well of emotion to pull from. When they finally filmed the scene in the middle of the night on a chilly porch in Reseda, the whole crew felt it. It wasn't just acting anymore, it was Morita putting his real history into Miyagi. Some crew members even admitted they were crying behind the cameras. The studio still wanted it cut the next morning, but both Morita and Avildsen pushed back hard. In the end, the scene stayed, and it became one of the most powerful parts of the movie. It also proved that Morita wasn't just a comedian from Happy Days. He was an actor who could carry a film's deepest emotional weight. Here's a behind-the-scenes detail most people don't realize. When filming started, neither Pat Morita nor Ralph Macchio had ever done karate before. The studio brought in Pat E. Johnson, a legendary stunt coordinator and Goju Ryu sensei, to train them, and his methods were intense. He literally barked at them for 6 hours a day, drilling punches, blocks, stances, and katas over and over. For Morita, this was brutal, not just mentally, but physically. Remember, he'd spent years as a kid in hospitals with spinal tuberculosis, and some of his vertebrae were fused. Every kick, every crane stance sent sharp pain through his back. He even taped aspirin packets inside his GI and popped them like candy just to get through the day. One afternoon, the body finally gave out. Morita collapsed mid-crane stance, and the set medic checked him. His pulse was 38, dangerously low. Production shut down for 3 full days while he recovered. But Morita wasn't about to let that stop him. When he returned, he wore a back brace painted the same color as his costume so the cameras wouldn't notice. And he pushed through every scene like nothing had happened. When producer Jerry Weintraub saw him limping and asked why, Morita just smiled and said, "Because Miyagi's old, boss." Old Men Limp Weintraub, still skeptical, muttered that he probably should have hired Toshiro Mifune instead, but Morita's quiet determination spoke louder than any argument. It's worth noting that while Morita picked up some techniques, many of Miyagi's complicated fight sequences were handled by Fumio Demura, a martial arts legend who even trained Bruce Lee. But here's the thing. Morita didn't need to kick high or punch fast to make Miyagi unforgettable. He brought the soul, the quiet wisdom, and the depth to the character that no stunt double could replicate. Between takes on set, Pat Morita had a habit that puzzled people. He would often wander behind the Miyagi house set, sit quietly, close his eyes, and stay perfectly still. Ralph Macchio once noticed this and finally asked what he was doing. Morita, without opening his eyes, told him, "Letting the dead speak." At first, it sounded like something mystical, almost like Miyagi himself, but it was very real and personal for him. Inside the secret pocket of his costume, Morita carried a small black and white photo of his father. It wasn't just for good luck. It was a connection to a loss he had carried for decades. His father had run a Chinese restaurant in Sacramento, and in 1945, He was beaten to death by 3 soldiers who thought a Japanese man shouldn't own a business after the war. Morita rarely talked about this tragedy, and he never shared it with the press. The only reason Machio ever heard about it was because of a late-night conversation at around 3 in the morning, while they picked at leftover sushi after a long shoot. That quiet, vulnerable exchange stuck with both of them. And here's where it gets interesting. If you rewatch the scene in the final dojo where Daniel asks Miyagi if he has family, you'll notice something. The pause, the little catch in Morita's breath, the heavy weight in the way he answers, "No more." That's not acting. That's memory. That's Morita pulling from his own grief and pouring it into Miyagi's world. It's one of those moments where the line between actor and character disappears, and that's part of what made the relationship between Morita and Machio so believable. They weren't just playing teacher and student, they were building a real bond. Morita later said their friendship was better than a marriage, and on screen, you can feel that connection. Now, when it came to the ending of The Karate Kid, things almost went in a very different direction. The original script had Miyagi quietly walking away after the tournament, almost like a drifting figure fading back into the night. At the first test screening, the crowd clapped politely, but that was it. It worked, but it didn't leave people buzzing when the credits rolled. That's when Morita pushed for something else. He suggested ending on a freeze frame of Miyagi's face as Daniel hugs him. No fade out, no dramatic music, just that pure, simple joy. The studio hated the idea, but they tested it anyway. The freeze frame scored an incredible 98% approval. That single change gave the film its unforgettable closing image, the one burned into everyone's memory. Morita later joked, "Even my face can beat the bad guys if you leave it up long enough." And just like that, his instincts, not the studio's, gave The Karate Kid its emotional knockout punch. When the Oscar nominations were announced, Pat Morita wasn't at some glamorous Hollywood party or glued to the television. He was asleep in a cheap motel in Fresno, working a small stand-up comedy gig for about $500 a week. His manager called him with the news, but Morita hung up twice because he thought it was just someone pulling a prank. Remember, this was a guy who had spent most of his career making people laugh in comedy clubs and on TV sitcoms. The idea that the Academy would recognize him for a serious, emotional role seemed almost impossible to believe. When it finally sank in, Morita did something that showed just how much the nomination meant to him. He drove straight to Manzanar, one of the internment camps where Japanese-American families, including his own, had been forced to live during World War II. He walked to the camp cemetery, a place that held heavy memories from his childhood, and left the nomination announcement folded under a stone. He quietly told his late father, "Dad, we got invited to the party. I'm taking you with me." For Morita, that gesture was more important than any red carpet celebration. It was his way of honoring the people who shaped his story and the pain that gave Miyagi's character so much authenticity. Morita didn't win. Hein S. Ngor took home the Oscar that year for The Killing Fields. But honestly, the nomination itself was already the victory. For a man who had been typecast as a clown for so long, just being recognized for a role that carried so much of his truth was validation enough. But success in Hollywood is never simple. The massive popularity of The Karate Kid and the Oscar buzz had an unexpected downside: typecasting. Almost overnight, the only roles people wanted him for were variations of the wise old Asian mentor. He was offered everything from karate-themed yogurt commercials to a sitcom idea literally called Miyagi and Me. Morita, with a mix of pride and frustration, told his wife, "I found the role of a lifetime, and it cost me the rest of my life." For about a decade, he stayed quiet about the behind-the-scenes fights, the casting battles, the studio memos, the moments he almost quit. He did conventions, signed autographs, and even responded to every fan letter by hand, often ending them with a simple line. Balance, my friend. He carried immense pride for the role, but also the ache of knowing Hollywood rarely saw him as anything more than Mr. Miyagi. And eventually, when he did open up, he revealed the truth that nobody in the studio ever wanted to admit. He revealed every studio memo, every threat of replacement, every night he cried in the dojo set, the raw, unfiltered truth of the fight he had waged. He confessed that the biggest fight wasn't with Jerry Weintraub or the studio executives, it was with himself, convincing himself that he deserved to tell a story that mattered, that his voice, his experiences, were worthy of being heard. He died at the age of 73, surrounded by family and friends. The cause of death was kidney failure following complications from a urinary tract infection and gallbladder issues. The tape sat in a drawer for a year before the family released it, a final, invaluable gift from an artist who had given so much. That interview, those final, honest words, are the spine of everything you just heard, revealing the true depth of the man behind the myth. If Pat Morita's own words changed how you see the Karate Kid, give this video a thumbs up and tell us your favorite Miyagi moment in the comments. And if you want more stories the studio hoped you'd never hear, more behind-the-scenes truths that reveal the human element behind the Hollywood machinery, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one.